They called him a ghost, a one-man army who liquidated 300 Russian soldiers with nothing but cold, calculated fury. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a force of nature that the battlefield itself couldn't contain. Having buried his past, he retreated into the frozen wilderness, seeking only the silence of peace. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. When his path crossed with a retreating Nazi battalion, they didn't just stumble upon a survivor, they awakened a predator. This isn't just a war movie. It's a masterclass in vengeance. Today, we're witnessing the legend of Sisu. In the harsh, frozen wilderness of Finland, lived a man named Korpi, a ghost of the battlefield, a man they called immortal. Once the deadliest commando in the Finnish army, his life had been forged in the crucible of tragedy. When Russian soldiers slaughtered his family, he didn't just mourn. He unleashed a vengeance so absolute, he single-handedly liquidated 300 enemy soldiers. His name became a whisper of terror, a legend among troops who swore he could survive anything, even death itself. But the man who thrived in the red mist of war had finally grown weary of the carnage. Seeking solitude, he retreated to the edge of the wilderness, living in the quiet isolation of the woods with only his horse and his faithful dog for company. One day, while working the banks of a nearby river, a glint caught his eye, shimmering golden flakes dancing in the silt. Korpi knew immediately what this meant. He began to dig, and before long, he struck a motherlode, a fortune that could lift him out of the suffocating poverty he'd endured for years. With trembling hands, he hauled his newfound wealth back to his cabin, spending a sleepless night clutching his rifle, eyes fixed on the shadows. You see, this was 1944. The Second World War was drawing to a close, and the Nazi forces were retreating, ordered to scorch the earth as they fled, leaving only ruin and ash in their wake. Korpi lived in terror that a raiding party might stumble upon his sanctuary and seize his future. Fortunately, the night passed in silence. At first light, Korpi packed his fortune onto his horse, whistling for his dog, and began the long, dangerous trek toward the nearest city. But his path was not meant to be clear. On the horizon, a column of dust announced the arrival of a Nazi patrol. Blocking the road sat the ruthless General Bruno, commanding a heavy tank with an entourage of trucks and soldiers trailing behind. In one of those trucks, the horrors of war were laid bare. A group of Finnish women, abducted and forced into a living nightmare by the soldiers' depravity. Korpi stood his ground, unafraid. He was a predator in his own right, and he knew that as long as he drew breath, no one was taking what was his. As the tension thickened like ice, a soldier named Wolf, fresh from brutalizing one of the captives, climbed atop the tank, his rifle leveled directly at Korpi's chest. But General Bruno held Wolf back. It wasn't out of mercy, far from it. Bruno knew his own reinforcements were trailing just behind them, and he wanted them to be the ones to handle the old man. Wolf lowered his rifle, seething, as they let Korpi pass. Further down the road, Korpi rode past a grim, haunting sight, bodies dangling from a telegraph pole, a chilling testament to the Nazis' path of destruction. Korpi didn't flinch. He had seen the true face of war 1,000 times before. To him, this was just the ugly, familiar landscape of a dying world. It wasn't long before 4 Nazi soldiers intercepted him, blocking the path with their transport vehicle. They barked orders for him to dismount. Korpi complied with eerie calm, stepping off his horse. The soldiers tore into his bags, and the moment the gold spilled out, their eyes lit up with a sickening, predatory greed. They decided right then that the old man wouldn't be leaving with his life. In that heartbeat, Korpi's demeanor shifted. He whispered a command to his dog, and the loyal animal bolted. The soldiers opened fire, bullets spitting into the dirt, but the dog was too fast. Not a single shot found its mark. One soldier sneered, mocking Korpi for his age, thinking he was nothing more than a frail, desperate old man. He raised his weapon to finish the job, but he was dead before he could even pull the trigger. With the speed of a striking viper, Korpi drove a combat knife straight through the soldier's skull. The remaining Nazis froze, the blood draining from their faces. But they had no time to react. Korpi was a whirlwind of lethal efficiency. He carved through them, driving his blade into one soldier's stomach before grabbing another and beating him to death with his own helmet. When the final soldier lunged from behind to pin him, Korpi twisted, snapped the man's arm with a sickening crunch, snatched his rifle, and ended the fight with a single point-blank shot. Miles away, the sound of gunfire echoed through the trees. Bruno and his men heard the shots and smirked, fully expecting their comrades to return with the old man's head and the stolen treasure. But when they arrived at the site, the silence was absolute. Bruno stepped out to find only the cooling corpses of his men. Corpi had vanished into the woods, a phantom in the fray. But as Bruno surveyed the carnage, he spotted a single, gleaming gold nugget lying in the dirt, a piece that had slipped from the soldier's pockets. His eyes locked onto the gold. He finally understood what he was chasing. Not just a man, but a king's ransom. And now, the hunt wasn't just about the war, it had become personal. Bruno wasted no time. He scanned the horizon with his binoculars, locking onto the trail like a wolf tracking wounded prey. He gunned the engine, closing the distance rapidly before unleashing the tank's devastating firepower. Shells rained down, tearing up the earth, but Corpi refused to break. He spurred his horse forward, weaving through the chaos, dodging death with a veteran's cold intuition. Yet Bruno wasn't just shooting, he was hurting. He had planted a minefield ahead, a lethal trap laid out to shatter the old man's momentum. And then it happened. The horse stepped directly onto a pressure plate, and in a sickening flash of fire and shrapnel, the animal was torn apart. Bruno watched through the smoke, certain that the blast had claimed Corpi too. But the legend was harder to kill than that. Corpi had survived, though he was bloodied, battered, and reeling from the loss of his loyal companion. As the gold lay scattered across the scorched earth like seeds of greed, Corpi scrambled to gather his fortune. Bruno arrived on the scene, his tank idling like a hungry beast. He ordered his men to hold fire, waiting for Corpi to do the heavy lifting. He wanted the gold gathered, not buried in a crater. Once the bags were full, Bruno gave the order to execute him. But Corpi was already 5 steps ahead. As he knelt to pack the last of the treasure, he didn't grab the gold. He snatched up a heavy rock. With pinpoint precision, he hurled it into the minefield. The resulting explosion ripped through the air, cloaking the battlefield in a thick, suffocating veil of smoke and dust. Corpi vanished into the gray void. The Nazis opened fire, blindly spraying lead into the smog, but they were shooting at a ghost. Corpi had used a steel plate as a makeshift shield, deflecting the hail of bullets that should have been his end. Bruno, convinced they had finished the job, ordered one of his men to step into the minefield to retrieve the bags. The soldier took a hesitant step forward, but before he could reach the gold, a mine, launched with terrifying force from deep within the smoke, smashed directly into him. A split second later, he was atomized. Bruno and his remaining men stood frozen, eyes wide in absolute horror. They were soldiers of the Third Reich, masters of modern warfare, yet they realized in that moment they were staring into the eyes of something far more lethal than a soldier. They weren't just fighting a man anymore, they were fighting a nightmare. Bruno was losing his mind. He sent 2 more soldiers into the minefield, but they barely took a step before the ground erupted, turning them into mist. As the smoke finally cleared, he scanned the area for his quarry, only to find the ground empty. Corpi was gone. Driven by a gluttonous, desperate need for that gold, Bruno made a decision that revealed the true depths of his depravity. He ordered the captive Finnish women out of the trucks. He forced them to walk ahead of the tank, using them as living minesweepers to pave his path through the gauntlet. Inside the tank, Bruno's eyes fell upon a discarded item, a piece of history that belonged to the man he was hunting. When he asked his officer about the name he had found, the officer's face went pale. The terror in the officer's voice was unmistakable. He couldn't believe Bruno was still alive after crossing paths with Corpi. He warned Bruno that the man wasn't just a soldier. He was a force of nature, a one-man army who had stopped taking orders long ago after the Russians slaughtered his family. He was a man who had already been to hell and back, and he was currently on a crusade of pure, unadulterated vengeance. The officer begged Bruno to turn back, to abandon the gold and save their lives while they still could. But Bruno wouldn't hear it. He was a man drowning in the consequences of a lost war, and he saw that gold as his only way to buy back his life. Meanwhile, a battered and bleeding Corpi had limped his way to the wreckage of a charred truck. He collapsed, his body riddled with bullet wounds. With the stoic resolve of a man who had survived 1,000 deaths, he dug the shards of shrapnel out of his own flesh, packing the wounds with dirt to stem the flow of blood. His loyal dog had tracked him down, but Corpi, knowing the danger was closing in, gave a silent command for the animal to retreat. The dog obeyed, watching from a distance as his master finally succumbed to exhaustion. But the peace was short-lived. The mechanical roar of Bruno's convoy shattered the silence, and Corpi's eyes snapped open. Bruno had unleashed his hounds, their baying echoing through the forest like a death knell. Corpy, sensing the trap closing in, slid beneath the chassis of a burned-out truck, holding his breath as the beasts paced nearby. Seeing his opening, he rolled under Bruno's idling supply truck, slashing the fuel line. A torrent of gasoline drenched him, masking his scent and effectively blinding the dogs to his trail. For a moment, confusion rippled through the Nazi ranks. They stood stagnant, scanning the treeline, unaware that their prey was inches away. But then, a mistake. Corpy attempted to slip away, and the sharp eyes of a hound caught his movement. The beast erupted into a frenzy of barking, and Bruno roared the command to fire. Bullets tore through the air, one finding its mark in Corpy's leg. He stumbled, diving behind a boulder as the dogs were unleashed to tear him apart. With the hounds closing in and nowhere left to run, Corpy looked toward the nearby lake. In a desperate, calculated move, he struck a match to his own oil-soaked clothes and plunged into the freezing depths. Bruno's men unleashed a hail of gunfire into the water, the surface churning with lead. Crimson plumes began to drift to the surface, and a grim satisfaction settled over the Nazis. They were convinced the old man had finally been put down. Bruno ordered 3 soldiers to take a boat out and confirm the kill. But the moment the first soldier dove in, the water turned into a butcher shop. Deep below, Corpy was waiting. With nothing but his blade, he butchered the man. A fresh cloud of blood bloomed on the surface, confirming he was not only alive, he was waiting. Bruno barked the order for the second soldier to dive in. The result was exactly the same. A violent, silent end beneath the waves. The third soldier, watching his comrades vanish into the red water, panicked. Ignoring Bruno's frantic screams, he grabbed the oars, desperate to get back to shore. Wolf, driven by sadistic rage, shot his own man dead before he could reach safety. But it was too late. Corpy emerged from the water, his hand gripping the corpse of the third soldier like a human shield. He hauled the body onto his shoulder, using it to absorb the wild gunfire from the bank as he sprinted into the treeline. Bruno and his men watched in stunned, paralyzed disbelief as their target vanished into the shadows once again. Bruno's eyes suddenly locked onto the silhouette of Corpy's dog, whimpering at the water's edge. The animal was grieving, unable to cross the lake to reach its master. A cruel, predatory grin spread across Bruno's face. He realized he didn't need to track the ghost. He had found the leash that would lead him straight to him. With the dog held captive, Bruno and his men pushed forward, closing the distance. By nightfall, Corpy had reached the outskirts of a town, or what was left of it. The Nazis had turned the place into a funeral pyre, the structure still glowing with embers and smoke. Exhausted and bleeding, Corpy dragged himself into a ruined gas station, looking for a moment of peace. But the silence didn't last. A familiar whine pierced the air. Corpy stepped outside, his pulse racing, only to see his loyal companion sprinting toward him, and strapped to the dog's body was a ticking death sentence. A charge of dynamite primed to detonate. Corpy didn't hesitate. He lunged, tearing the explosives from the dog just as they erupted. The force of the blast sent him careening through the air, slamming into the hard earth. He lay there, broken and shattered, unable to even rise. Bruno and his wolves moved in, their boots crunching on the charred debris. They had him. With brutal efficiency, they dragged the limp, semi-conscious Corpy to a nearby pole, cinching a rope around his neck and hauling him up. As the world faded to black for the old warrior, the Nazi soldiers paused, instinctively removing their caps in a grim, twisted gesture of respect. He was an enemy, yes, but he was a god of war who had refused to break until his very last breath. Confident the job was done, Bruno looted the gold, sneering as he tucked a single nugget into Corpy's pocket. A final, mocking insult. They turned and vanished into the night. But legends don't die on command. Corpy was merely waiting, his lungs burning, his senses razor-sharp behind closed eyes. As soon as the sound of their engines faded, he moved. He jammed his foot against a jagged nail protruding from the pole, using it to fight for a sliver of leverage. His foot slipped, tearing into his skin, grinding against the fresh bullet wound in his leg, sending waves of white-hot agony through his body. As the first light of dawn broke, the roar of an engine shattered the morning stillness. A Nazi aircraft thundered overhead, the sheer force of its passing air snapping the weakened pole. Corpy crashed to the dirt, the world spinning, his loyal dog rushing to his side. The plane circled and touched down nearby, two soldiers stepping out to investigate. They froze, staring in disbelief at the man they had hanged. A man who refused to let death claim him. One soldier leveled his rifle, ready to finish the task, but Corpy was faster than a strike of lightning. He lunged at the soldier's legs, sending him spiraling into a rock with a sickening crack that silenced him instantly. Before the second soldier could draw his weapon, Corpy hammered a brick into his skull, ending his struggle in a heartbeat. Corpy stood over the bodies, his eyes falling on that single, mocking nugget of gold in his pocket. It was a fragment of the fortune that had been stolen from him, a fortune he now vowed to reclaim. He knew Bruno was long gone, but his gaze shifted to the plane. It was his ticket to vengeance. With cold, surgical precision, he dug the remaining shrapnel from his wounds, cauterizing them with fuel to stave off the infection, before climbing into the cockpit and taking to the skies. Miles away, Bruno's convoy was pushing toward their extraction point. But the horizon held a grim surprise. Ahead lay a crashed aircraft, and draped around its wreckage was the very rope Bruno had used to hang Corpy the night before. Bruno's heart stopped. The impossible had happened, the ghost was still walking. Panicked, he screamed for his men to accelerate, desperate to outrun the inevitable. In the trailing supply truck, the mood turned suffocating. As the soldiers nervously discussed the legend of the immortal man, one of the captive Finnish women looked at them, her eyes burning with a dark, prophetic fire. "You can run as far as you want," she whispered, "but if Corpy is hunting you, he will find you. Not even the Reaper can save you now. Just wait for your death." The words hadn't even left her lips when the night became a weapon. Corpy struck from the shadows, his hands finding a soldier's throat and ending his life before a single sound could escape. As the second soldier leaned out to investigate the sudden silence, Corpy didn't hesitate. He seized the man and hurled him from the speeding truck, sending him tumbling directly into the path of the following tank. Corpy moved like a shadow, clinging to the top of the supply truck, his presence completely undetected by the soldiers ahead. He slipped into the truck carrying the captive women, and the moment he saw the horrors they had been forced to endure, his expression hardened into a mask of pure fury. He handed his rifles to the women, then drove his blade through the driver's skull with clinical precision. One of the women scrambled behind the wheel, gunning the engine to pull alongside the enemy transport. In a hail of gunfire, the women exacted their vengeance, cutting down every Nazi soldier on the other truck in a ruthless flurry of lead. While the chaos unfolded, Corpy leaped onto Bruno's tank, his fingers clawing at the hatch to reach the coward inside. But Bruno saw him coming. He slammed the brakes, the sudden jolt tossing Corpy onto the dirt. Wolf erupted from the tank, his weapon spitting fire, but Corpy was a blur of motion. He dodged the barrage, lunged onto the tank's hull, and delivered a savage beating to Wolf, tossing him to the ground. Bruno, seeing his chance, abandoned his comrade without a second thought. He gunned the tank, speeding toward the airfield with his final remaining soldier, leaving Wolf to his fate. Corpy raised his weapon to finish Wolf, but the roar of motorcycles cut through the air. Two Nazi soldiers arrived, but the moment they saw the man standing over Wolf, their blood went cold. They knew the legend, they knew what Corpy was, and they turned their bikes and fled, leaving their comrade behind. Corpy didn't waste a bullet. He kicked the bike into gear and tore after the tank. Left defenseless, Wolf realized his nightmare wasn't over. The women he had so viciously tormented emerged from the carnage, surrounding him, and finished the job with a brutal, righteous ferocity that silenced his screams forever. Bruno finally reached the airfield, the plane waiting with its engine screaming. In a final act of treachery, he turned and gunned down his last companion, ensuring he wouldn't have to share his spoils. He scrambled into the cockpit, the plane beginning its roll toward the sky. But just as the wheels threatened to leave the tarmac, Corpy surged onto the scene, his rifle erupting in a rhythmic, punishing cadence. Bullets chewed into the fuselage, but the plane was already picking up speed, accelerating into the air. But Corpy wasn't finished. As the plane roared down the runway, he hooked his pickaxe into the fuselage and hauled himself into the air, dangling beneath the belly of the beast. With a calculated strike, he tore through the metal, breaching the rear compartment. Bruno, alerted by the sudden structural intrusion, threw open the door, only to be met with the fury of a man who refused to stay dead. The two titans clashed in the cramped, shaking cabin. Bruno unloaded his weapon, hammering blows into the exhausted warrior, beating him until Corpy could barely see. But even on the brink of collapse, Corpy's mind remained a tactical weapon. His eyes locked onto a high-altitude bomb strapped inside the hold. In one fluid, desperate motion, he looped the bomb's hook around Bruno's arm and kicked the cargo hatch wide open. The sudden vacuum whipped through the cabin, dragging Bruno out into the abyss. Seconds later, a thunderous explosion rocked the sky as Bruno hit the earth. His ambition and his life disintegrated in a single, fiery blast. But the danger wasn't over. The plane bucked, spiraling out of control. Corpy scrambled to the cockpit, only to find the pilot slumped over the controls, a casualty of Bruno's own wild gunfire. With no parachute and the ground rushing up to meet him, Corpy made his final play. He grabbed his bags of gold, lashed himself to a sturdy section of the fuselage, and braced for impact. The plane slammed into a swampy mire with a deafening crash, sinking into the muck. Yet, once again, the legend emerged from the wreckage, alive. Meanwhile, the women Corpy had liberated triumphantly rolled into their military camp, with the carcass of Wolf lashed to the top of the Nazi tank, a grisly trophy of their survival. They were finally safe, their nightmare ended by the man who had fought for them. Some time later, a scarred and battered figure walked into a bank. The room went dead silent as the patrons parted like the Red Sea, staring at the man who looked like head crawled out of hell itself. Corpy stepped up to the counter, dumped his bags of gold, and spoke with the quiet, gravelly weight of a survivor. "I want this exchanged." The staff stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer mountain of wealth sitting before them, a fortune that had cost rivers of blood and the lives of hundreds. And that is the legend of Sisu. But make no mistake, this is far from the end. The next chapter of this saga is even more explosive, and you're going to want a front row seat. If you're ready to see how the legend continues, smash that subscribe button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Is he truly unstoppable? I'll see you in the next one.